Doctors gave up on the billionaire's son. Then a homeless boy did the impossible. The machines had stopped beeping the way they used to. Now they only whispered, slow and steady, like a countdown no one wanted to admit they were hearing. In a private wing of St. Video, Augustine's hospital, behind a door guarded by two men in dark suits, an 8-year-old boy named Ethan Whitfield lay motionless beneath a tangle of tubes and wires, while outside that door, his father, a man who could buy the hospital itself if he wanted to, stood with his forehead pressed against the wall, silently begging a God he had never believed in to give him back his son. If you believe in second chances, in kindness that shows up when you least expect it, and in the idea that miracles don't always wear expensive shoes, smash that like button, drop a comment below, share this with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to the channel, because this story is about to remind you why we never stop believing in people. Richard Whitfield had built an empire from nothing. He was the kind of man magazines called a visionary, the kind of man who negotiated billion-dollar mergers before breakfast, and never once raised his voice in a boardroom because he never needed to. But none of that mattered anymore. Not the private jets, not the mansion on the hill, not the 17 companies that bore his name. All of it had become background noise the moment the doctors sat him down 3 weeks ago and told him that Ethan had a rare and aggressive neurological condition, something so uncommon that only a handful of cases existed in medical literature, and that despite every specialist flown in from every corner of the world, despite every experimental treatment money could unlock, Ethan's body was shutting down and there was nothing more medicine could do. Richard had raised Ethan alone since his wife passed away when the boy was only 2, and in the years since, the two of them had become inseparable in that quiet way only broken families understand, not needing many words, just needing to be near each other. Ethan wasn't spoiled by wealth. He was gentle, curious, endlessly kind, the kind of child who would give his lunch to a classmate without being asked, who once cried for a week after learning that some children didn't have homes to sleep in. Richard used to joke that his son had the softest heart in the family and probably the whole city. Now that same soft heart was failing, quite literally, and Richard would have traded every dollar he'd ever earned for one more year, one more month, one more ordinary Tuesday morning with his son laughing over pancakes. The head neurologist, a tired but honest man named Dr. Alvarez, finally said the words no parent should ever have to hear. He said they had exhausted every avenue, that Ethan's brain activity was declining and his organs were beginning to follow, and that the kindest thing now might be to make him comfortable rather than continue treatments that caused him pain without hope of recovery. Richard did not shout. He did not break down in front of the doctor. He simply nodded, walked out into the hallway, and sat down on the floor like his legs had forgotten how to hold him up, because for the first time in his life there was no deal to make, no check to write, no favor to call in that could fix this. That same night, 3 miles away in an alley behind a bakery that had long since closed for the evening, a 12-year-old boy named Malik was doing what he did most nights. Searching through the tossed-out bread crates for anything still edible, humming softly to keep himself from feeling how cold the concrete was beneath him. Malik had been on the streets for almost 2 years. Ever since his mother passed from an illness the free clinics couldn't quite catch in time, and there had been no father, no aunts, no uncles, nobody left to take him in. The city had a way of swallowing kids like Malik whole, turning them invisible, and most people walked past him without a second glance. The way you walk past a lamppost or a stray cat. But Malik was not ordinary, not in the way people assume when they see a barefoot boy in a torn jacket. Malik remembered everything he read. He had spent years of his childhood, before things fell apart, obsessively borrowing library books on the human body, on chemistry, on how blood moved and cells divided, because his mother had once been a nursing assistant, and used to bring home old textbooks for him to flip through while she worked double shifts. Reading had been his escape, and medicine, strange as it sounds for a homeless boy, had become his quiet obsession. The night everything changed began with a coincidence so small it almost didn't happen at all. Malik had wandered near St. Augustine's hospital looking for a warm grate to sleep beside, and it was there, huddled against the loading dock wall, that he overheard 2 nurses on their cigarette break talking in hushed, devastated voices about the Whitfield boy and how heartbreaking it was that nothing more could be done, how the case had stumped every specialist because of some unusual pattern in his blood work that nobody could quite explain. Most kids would have kept walking, but something in Malik stirred, Some old, half-forgotten instinct from all those nights poring over his mother's dog-eared anatomy books, and he found himself asking the nurses in his soft, rough voice what exactly was unusual about the blood work. The nurses, more out of exhausted pity than expectation, actually answered him, thinking it was harmless to humor a curious street kid. They mentioned an odd enzyme marker, something rarely tested for because it wasn't part of standard panels. Something that only showed up in very specific inherited metabolic disorders. And Malik, standing there in the cold with holes in his sneakers, felt his heart start pounding, because he remembered reading about that exact marker in an old water-stained textbook he'd found in a donation bin 2 years earlier, a chapter about a rare condition that mimicked neurological decline but was actually caused by a metabolic imbalance the body couldn't process on its own. And, crucially, a condition that was treatable if caught in time but almost always missed because doctors were trained to look for the more common explanations first. He tried to tell the nurses, of course they didn't believe him. Why would they? To them, he was just a homeless kid rambling about something he couldn't possibly understand, and they gently told him to get some rest and walked back inside, laughing softly at the strange encounter, already forgetting it by the time they reached the nurses' station. But Malik didn't forget. He sat outside that hospital for the rest of the night, arguing with himself, telling himself it wasn't his place, that no one would ever listen to a boy like him, that he'd probably gotten it wrong anyway. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw the desperate look on those nurses' faces, and he thought about his own mother, about how she died because a diagnosis came 1 week too late, and something in him refused to let that happen to someone else if there was even the smallest chance he was right. So the next morning, cold and hungry and shaking with nerves he'd never felt before, Malik walked through the hospital's main entrance like he belonged there, because he had learned long ago that confidence was the only currency a homeless kid had. He made his way toward the private wing, and it was pure chance, or maybe something more than chance, that he crossed paths with Richard Whitfield himself, sitting alone in the family lounge with his head in his hands, looking like a man who had aged a decade in 3 weeks. Malik almost turned back. Almost. But he thought of his mother one more time, took a breath, and quietly said that he thought he knew what was wrong with Ethan. Richard barely looked up at first. He assumed it was some well-meaning stranger, or worse, someone trying to exploit his pain, and he was too exhausted to entertain it. But something about the boy's voice made him lift his head, a kind of quiet certainty that didn't match the ragged clothes or the dirt on his hands. Richard, against every instinct built from years of guarding himself from scammers and opportunists, found himself asking the boy what he meant. And Malik, stumbling at first but growing steadier with every sentence, explained what he had overheard, explained the enzyme marker, explained the rare metabolic condition from the textbook he'd read years ago, explained that if he was right, there was a specific and simple test that could confirm it, a test that wasn't part of the standard workup, because the condition was so rare most doctors never even considered it. Richard should have dismissed it. Every logical part of him screamed that this made no sense, that a street kid could not possibly know something that had escaped a team of the world's top specialists. But grief has a way of cracking open doors that logic would otherwise keep shut, and Richard was desperate enough, broken enough, to grasp at anything. He walked the boy directly to Dr. Alvarez's office himself, ignoring the security guard's confused stare, and asked the doctor, as a father and not as anything else, to please just consider running the test the boy was describing. Dr. Alvarez, to his credit, did not laugh the boy out of the room. He was tired enough, humbled enough by 3 weeks of failure, to entertain even the strangest possibility. He listened to Malik describe the condition in more clinical detail than any 12-year-old should have been capable of, watched the boy's eyes as he explained the biochemical pathway with a kind of quiet, hungry intelligence, and something in the doctor's gut told him this wasn't nothing. He ordered the specialized test that afternoon, mostly to put the matter to rest, mostly because Richard's eyes were pleading in a way that no father should ever have to plead. The wait for results felt like its own kind of death. Richard sat in that same hallway floor spot, and this time, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he asked Malik to sit with him. They didn't say much. Richard learned that Malik's mother had died 2 years ago, that he had been living on the streets ever since, that he read anything he could get his hands on because books didn't care whether you had a home or not. And somewhere in that quiet hallway, 2 people from opposite ends of the world sat shoulder to shoulder, bound by the same fragile thread of hope. When the results came back 6 hours later, Dr. Alvarez walked out of the lab with a look on his face that Richard had never seen on a doctor before. Not the practiced calm of delivering bad news, but something closer to disbelief. The test was positive. Ethan did have the rare metabolic disorder, exactly as Malik had described, a condition so uncommon it wasn't even part of routine differential diagnoses. A condition that had been quietly poisoning Ethan's system while doctors chased the wrong culprit for weeks. And more than that, it was treatable. Not easily, not without risk, but treatable, with a specific dietary and enzyme replacement protocol that could halt and potentially reverse the damage if administered quickly enough. The next 72 hours were the longest of Richard's life. Ethan was moved into intensive treatment, his tiny body responding to a combination of therapies that days earlier no one even knew he needed. Richard barely left the hospital, and neither strangely did Malik, who Richard had quietly arranged a room and meals for, unable to simply let the boy vanish back into the cold after what he'd done. On the fourth day, Ethan's eyes fluttered open for the first time in nearly 3 weeks, and the first blurry thing he saw, past his father's tear-streaked face, was a thin boy in a hospital cafeteria hoodie standing shyly by the door, smiling like he'd just watched his own mother's memory finally mean something. Recovery did not happen overnight, and the story would be dishonest if it pretended otherwise. Ethan spent another month in the hospital, relearning strength in muscles that had weakened, adjusting to a lifelong treatment plan that would manage his condition for the rest of his life. But he was alive and improving and laughing again in that soft way that used to fill Richard's house before all of this began. Every single day of that month, Malik visited, sitting by Ethan's bed, telling him stories from the books he'd read, and Ethan in turn would ask him question after question, fascinated by this strange, brilliant boy who had appeared out of nowhere and somehow saved his life. Richard could never fully repay what Malik had done, not because he lacked the money, but because some debts aren't meant to be settled with money at all. Still, he tried, in the ways that mattered. He didn't just hand Malik a check and send him on his way because he understood, watching this boy interact with his son, that Malik's gift wasn't luck. It was a mind that deserved to be nurtured, not wasted on cold sidewalks and library donation bins. Richard enrolled Malik in one of the city's best schools, arranged tutors to fill the educational gaps 2 years on the street had created, and set up a trust that would carry the boy through every level of education he wanted to pursue, all the way, if he chose, to medical school itself. But more than the tuition, more than the roof over his head, Richard gave Malik something the boy hadn't had in 2 long years. A family that wanted him there, not out of obligation, but out of genuine grateful love. Ethan began calling him brother within the first week, and by the time winter came again, nobody in that household corrected him. If this story has touched even a small piece of your heart, please don't scroll past without letting us know. Hit that like button, leave a comment below, and share this video with someone who might need a reminder today that kindness, no matter how small or how unlikely its source, can change the entire course of a life. Before you go, we'd love for you to comment just one word below, the word hope, so we know how many of you believe, like we do, that miracles sometimes arrive wearing torn sneakers instead of white coats. Years later, Malik did go on to study medicine, driven not by ambition or money, but by the memory of a mother he lost too soon and a promise he made to himself in a cold hospital hallway that no other family should ever have to feel what he felt that night. Ethan grew into a healthy, curious teenager who still, to this day, introduces Malik as his brother before he explains anything else about him. And Richard Whitfield, a man who once measured his worth in mergers and empires, would tell anyone who asked that the single greatest deal he ever made in his life was the one he never planned for. The quiet, impossible gift of a homeless boy who refused to walk away, and in doing so, gave a father back his son, and gave a broken boy a family to finally call his own.